StoryCon presents BackStory, a podcast featuring writers, readers, and their stories, hosted by best-selling author Jennifer A. Nielsen.
Between the rugged canyon mountains on the west and the lush Black Mountains on the east lies beautiful Paradise Valley, Montana. At one time, it would have been the entrance to Yellowstone National Park. If you're a fan of the show Yellowstone, Paradise Valley is home to the fictional Dutton Ranch. But in real life, it was Christopher's home. At least 30 minutes from any town of any size, Christopher grew up Tom Sawyer style, wading in rivers, climbing trees, building forts, and crafting homemade bows and arrows from the pliable trees that grew near the Yellowstone River. It wasn't all play, of course. There's always work to be done on a ranch, and Christopher's parents wanted him to get the best possible education. His mother, a Montessori-trained teacher, began homeschooling. There in the wild, Christopher soaked in knowledge like a sponge. While other kids might have had their summers off, Christopher's education continued, which meant, by age 15, he was a high school graduate. And for 2 weeks, that was the most amazing thing ever. After that, then what? There was no television, no internet. He was too young for college, didn't yet have his driver's license, and his closest neighbors a half-mile away had no kids he might hang out with. So Christopher did what a lot of young people might do if they get bored enough. He grabbed a shovel and began digging through the dense gravel and packed dirt in his backyard. Now, this is something you should know about Christopher. He doesn't do anything on a small scale. That hole grew to 9 feet in diameter and was 9 feet deep. An old-fashioned satellite dish was on their property, long out of use. It was at least 12 feet from one side to the other, and once Christopher dragged it over the top of his hole, it served as an excellent roof. After that, he used hay for a layer of insulation, then topped it with ripped bark from trees to create shingles. Now you might wonder, how did Christopher get inside this Viking hut as he had come to think of it? A tunnel, of course. One he dug out and then lined with trees he had cut using the best tool available to him, a claw hammer. Looking back, Christopher realizes the magic of that time in his life, not because of the Viking hut itself, but because he recognizes the value in boredom, the value for all of us. Boredom opens up the opportunity for a person to drift into the place where they can create. For Christopher, that creation was in telling stories. He wanted to write the kind of stories he had grown up reading, stories of dragons and swords and magic and adventure. But it had to be something more than the 5 or 6 page stories he had written before. The idea in his mind would be much longer, certainly beyond anything he had ever before attempted. He began writing, but the story would hit a roadblock, and so he'd try another version, then another, and another. One day he noticed that books on how to write had begun appearing in the house. His parents never pushed him to write, but in their quiet way, they were supporting his efforts. One of the books, Story by Robert McKee, revolutionized Christopher's way of thinking. Methodically, Christopher first built his fantasy world, then formed the plot within that world. Instead of writing, he continued on, creating a story arc for a trilogy, because after all, aren't all of his favorite fantasy novels in trilogies? Now he was ready to write. Never thinking of it as his debut novel, it was his practice novel because, as he had learned, all writers have to start with a practice novel, don't they? That first draft was an incredible experience for Christopher, mostly because he had no idea what he was doing. At times it was challenging and frustrating, and he often doubted whether he'd ever type the end. Yet he stuck with it. 500 pages later, he printed out the manuscript and for the first time read his epic fantasy story, centering on the great heroic character that he had named Kevin. That wasn't the worst of it. Within a few pages of reading, he realized how awful the draft was. But that was a good thing. If he could see the flaws, then he must have some real talent. There was only one problem. He had no idea how to fix the flaws. Once again, Christopher's parents were there to help him with the editing process. As the manuscript began to take form, another plan formed as well. They would self-publish this novel and turn it into a family business. For the next year, this became the entire family's focus, and finally, the book was self-published and available on Amazon. That introduced another problem. No one knew about the book. So Christopher began speaking at local libraries and bookstores, selling a few copies here and there, but never enough to reach enough of an audience to justify the travel expenses. His parents had taken off work to help him promote this book, so finances had become tight. If things didn't change, the family would soon be in danger of losing their home. So Christopher stepped up yet again, doing school visits, 2 to 3 schools a day, month after month. He wore a medieval costume, poured his heart into each presentation, and finally began seeing results. As many as 300 books a day were selling. Finally, his family was making money, but that money had to be used for travel or to print more books. The plan was working, barely, and there were no guarantees that it would ever lead to anything greater. Then amazingly, Carl Hiaasen, the author of Hoot and other titles, purchased a copy of Christopher's book for his son, who loved it. Carl sent the manuscript to Random House, and soon after, it was picked up for traditional publication. It was a cold day in Portland when Christopher got that offer from Random House. But it wasn't an automatic yes for him. What would happen to this story that he had worked so hard on if a new editor became involved? Well, as Christopher left that event in Portland, he noticed a metal washer laying in the parking lot. He picked it up and later turned it into a ring. Christopher still has it to this day. That ring matters because that's the day Christopher said yes to Random House. It's the day his entire life changed. In his first draft, the story featured a main character named Kevin. In the subsequent drafts, the name changed to Aragon, and Christopher Paolini's book by the same title went on to be a tremendous success, along with the rest of his inheritance cycle, and they remain popular even today. Christopher has written several other titles, both fantasy and science fiction, which have been adored by fans all over the world. But it began with Aragon, the story of a boy from a place most people had never heard of, who goes on to change the landscape of his world. Maybe that's who Christopher Paolini is as well. Join me next Friday to hear the full interview with Christopher Paolini, and please keep listening because we have so many amazing authors still to come.
BackStory is brought to you by StoryCon. StoryCon is the evolution of Teen Author Boot Camp, the largest combined writing camp and fan expo in the Intermountain West. Join us on February 21st and 22nd, 2025 at the Salt Palace Convention Center in Salt Lake City, Utah. The event will feature keynote speeches and masterclasses from internationally best-selling authors like Jeff Kinney, Neil Shusterman, Shannon Hale, Marissa Meyer, and many more. Other activities include an exhibitor hall that's free to the public, writing contests, and the Operation Literacy Awards Gala. Visit storycon.org today to register. That's STORYCON.org. Hurry, masterclasses have a limited space. Thank you for listening to BackStory. If you'd like to enjoy more episodes, visit us at storycon.org/backstory. That's STORYCON.org/backstory.